If you're interested in Microsoft, you will love Windows Weekly every Wednesday on the Twit Network. Hi, this is Leo Laporte inviting you to join me, Paul Thurrott, and Richard Campbell for this week's episode. Paul will debunk that recall security flaw. Nothing to worry about here. Lots of news about AI and Xboxes, and Paul's got a review of a new Snapdragon X2 Elite laptop. That's this week on Windows Weekly. You'll find it at twit.tv/WW or wherever you get your podcasts. Every Tuesday, we talk security and privacy on Security Now. Hi, this is Leo Laporte, inviting you to join me and Steve Gibson this week as we talk about Microsoft's changes in their Edge browser, not going to leave passwords in plain text anymore, and apparently serious zero-point quantum vacuum energy source. Can that be real? And then AI models designed to improve security, not just from Anthropic, but OpenAI and Microsoft too. All of that this week on Security Now. You'll find it at twit.tv/SN or wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Most Notorious podcast. I'm Erik Rivenes. Thank you for joining me. My guest today is Jeffrey Smalldon. He is a board-certified forensic psychologist who spent decades studying the minds of violent offenders and consulting on hundreds of death penalty cases. Over the course of his career, he corresponded with and interviewed some of the most notorious killers in history, including members of the Manson family, Ted Bundy, and John Wayne Gacy. The focus of our interview today is his 2024 memoir, That Beast Was Not Me. A forensic psychologist looks back on 5 decades of murder. Great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Erik. Good to be here.
So when did you first become interested in true crime? Do you remember when it kind of clicked for you?
Yeah, I do remember. We were living in Bethesda, Maryland. My dad was an FBI agent, and he was assigned to headquarters in Washington. And I just remember we took a family trip to Ford's Theater. And I always say, I was 8 years old, and most kids probably would have come away with a renewed fascination in Lincoln or the Civil War, but I was fixated on the 8 conspirators in the plot to kill the president. And my parents bought me a book called The Crime at Ford's Theater, and I just pored over it, and I memorized the histories of all 8 members of the plot to kill Lincoln. And I still have, after 60 years, I still have vivid, almost photographic memories of each of them, emblazoned on my brain somehow. And around that same time, I remember there were repeated teasers on television for a documentary on the Great Train Robbery. And I remember arguing with my mom because I wanted to stay up late so I could watch that. The Great Train Robbery, I don't know. I thought it sounded incredibly interesting. She wouldn't let me stay up. But those are 2 things that happened at around the same time that I usually look back to as sort of the first indicators of what became a long-term interest, not just in criminals and killers, but in outsiders of all kinds. As I said, I was the son of an FBI agent, and one thing that meant in those days was that we moved every year or two. FBI agents kept getting transferred. So our family was always on the move. By the time we settled in Western New York, a town named North Tonawanda near Buffalo and Niagara Falls, right before the beginning of my 4th grade year, we had lived 8 different places. So I was sort of a wanderer in my early years and often felt like an outsider myself, having to adjust to new places, new schools, make new friends, and so on. And maybe that contributed to my sensitivity to the outlook of the outsider or my interest in it. But before too long, I said I was eighth grade at the time of the trip to Ford's Theater, and it wasn't long before I developed an enduring interest in things like sideshow performers and serpent handlers who drank strychnine and handled venomous snakes during their worship services, and all kinds of other outsiders, nudists, dousers, roller derby queens. I mean, I was just always interested in sort of the strange, unusual people.
So your father was a G-man, basically.
He was.
Was he an on-the-ground field agent? And was he involved in any cases that we might recognize?
Probably not. He was a street. He referred to himself as a street agent. And that one year that he spent assigned to bureau headquarters in Washington in 1961, 62, he didn't really like that because too much of his job was administrative and he wanted to get back on the street. He really enjoyed cultivating networks of informants and so on. And I said that we moved to a town near Niagara Falls just before the start of my fourth grade year. And my dad, before long, became in charge of the sort of satellite FBI office in Niagara Falls. And the mafia was his main beat because there was so much organized crime activity around the border. And so he loved, as I said, working the streets, developing his informants. And that's what he did for many years while we lived in Western New York. And yeah, I mean, I always describe my dad as a Hoover era G-man because it conjures just the right image of my dad, briefcase and, suit. And when he would come home for lunch, shoulder holster with a pistol in it. And yeah, I mean, I think of him as an old school G-man.
Did he ever have interactions with J. Edgar Hoover?
Yeah, he would have. Certainly during that year he spent assigned to headquarters. One time he took our whole family in to meet Hoover. On my website, I have a picture of our family with J. Edgar Hoover. It's sort of a classic in any number of ways. Hoover has got his hands on my sisters and my shoulders, and my sister has she wins the prize for best accessory in that picture. She had a lucky rabbit's foot dangling from her purse, and I looked like my parents were way, way behind a growth spurt. I had a sport coat on that was about 3 sizes too small for me. But I remember that day still vividly after all these years. My parents, my paternal grandmother, and my sister and me with J. Edgar Hoover.
Wow. So it was early on, right in college, when you developed a fascination with the book Helter Skelter, right?
I did, and it's funny, Eric, that when the murders that gave rise to Charles Manson's infamy took place in August of 1969, I was oblivious. I was pretty much, my preoccupations at that time were getting ready for football season of my junior year in high school and hanging out with my friends and listening to music. So I didn't follow that case at all. I never watched TV. I didn't read the newspaper. So I was oblivious to it. But then I went to England to spend my junior year abroad in Cambridge. And while I was traveling with a buddy of mine, I picked up off one of those like bus depot wire rotating stands that hold paperback books. And there was one on there with this just arresting picture, the English edition of Ed Sanders' The Family, about the Manson family. And I thought, well, that looks interesting. I was drawn to the picture of Manson's face on the cover. And I read that and I just, I raced through it. I thought it was so interesting. And then when I returned to the United States for the second half of my junior year and then my senior year, in that year, 1974, that's when Helter Skelter came out. And so I immediately got it because I'd been interested in the Manson case after reading The Family. And I couldn't put down Helter Skelter. I read it in a single setting, starting at about early one afternoon and going all night, caffeine fueled binge, and finished it at about 11 o'clock or noon the next day. I couldn't put it down. And one day I was taking a class in abnormal psychology my senior year, and my professor mentioned in class one day that he had read Helter Skelter. And I thought, well, I'm going to stay around after class and talk with him about it. So I did. And while we were talking about it, I made a comment about how intriguing it was that any number of the people who gathered around Manson and seemed prepared to do his bidding came from middle class families, not all that unlike my own. And I said to my professor, if you just read newspaper accounts of these people, you'd get the impression that they were zombies who had basically surrendered their free will and were just willing to do anything at Manson's behest. And I said, I wonder if things are a little more complicated than that. And he said, yeah, I wondered the same thing when I read Helter Skelter. Have you ever considered writing to some of those people? And no, that thought had never, ever crossed my mind. And he said, well, it might be interesting to hear what they sounded like speaking in their own voices. And so I didn't act on that right away. But after a few weeks, I decided, well, okay, I doubt when any of these people will answer my letter, but I'll give it a shot. And so I wrote to Manson, and at around the same time, I wrote to the person who was widely recognized as his second command. She was not in custody at the time, Lynette Squeaky Fromm, who, as it turns out, was living in Sacramento near Folsom Prison with another fanatic Manson devotee, Sandy Good. And much to my surprise, Manson wrote me back almost immediately. He responded to my first letter in a very prickly way, saying in so many words, "You're full of shit. Don't bother me unless you're willing to be honest about who you are and why you're really writing me." I was certainly capable of my own manipulation at that time, and I had tried to convince him in my first letter that the main reason I was writing was because I was interested in his songs and lyrics. I knew he was a frustrated musician, and I threw that out as my bait, hoping that it would prompt a response. And he saw right through that. He knew that wasn't my main interest. So he wrote that prickly response. And then I wrote him back a much more self revealing letter. I told him I was a senior in college. I'd read Helter Skelter and The Family by Ed Sanders. And my hook this time was to say, so I've read a lot about your case, but I'm very open to the possibility that the authorities got some things wrong. And I was sure that would interest him because I knew by that time that he thought the authorities had gotten lots of things wrong.
Yeah.
And so he wrote me back a much more contemplative, interesting letter. And it was in that second letter that he said in one of the first sentences, "That beast was not me," referencing media portrayals of him as this monster. And he said, "That beast was not me, but it's what everyone needs me to be. So they make me up to be a reflection of their fears, lies, and bullshit." And that statement always struck in my mind. And when it came time to settle on a title for my book, I used that beast was not me, because it stands for repeat killers' reluctance to accept anyone else's definition of who they are or explanation for why they did what they did. They're much too self-centered to want to accept anyone else's limiting description of who they are. And I also there was a second reason why I chose "That beast was not me. And that's that, that sounds on its surface like that's me announcing that there's a very bold line between these people who've interested me, Ted Bundy, Charles Manson, John Wayne Gacy, and myself. But throughout my book, I raise questions about difficulties that arise whenever we try to draw too bold a line between the rest of us and the people who commit these crimes. So I chose it for that reason as well. Now, around that same time that I wrote to Manson, I wanted to write, I was really interested in the Manson girls, the so-called Manson girls. And I wanted to write to Squeaky Fromm, but I didn't know where she was. I had no idea where she was. I just knew she wasn't in custody. So this was a real long shot, but looking back, I applaud myself for my resourcefulness. I remembered reading in Helter Skelter that there was an assistant prosecutor in the same office that prosecuted Manson and four of his followers and secured death sentences for them. But there was an assistant prosecutor in that office who had befriended the Manson women while they were sitting vigil outside the Hall of Justice where his trial was. And in the book, he was quoted as saying, there's a great deal about these people that I admire. I admire their interest in peace, love. He apparently bought some things that to me seemed like they would have been hard to buy, but he did. And his wife baked them Christmas cookies and so on. So I thought, I wonder if he could steer me to Squeaky Fromm and Sandy Good, because I knew they would be together. They were best buds. And so I wrote a letter to Squeaky and Sandy and put it in an envelope, left the address blank, and I sent it to him, care of the prosecutor's office in LA. And in my cover letter to him, I said, if you know where Squeaky and Sandy are, would you be willing to send them my letter, complete the address on my envelope and send them my letter? And I thought, he's never going to respond to this.
Yeah.
This kid in the Midwest who he's never heard of before. But he did. He responded right away. And he said, yes, I do know where they are. I can't give you their address. That'll be up to them if they want to. But I've sent them your letter. And then within a week, Squeaky responded. And that began a very interesting 3 or 4 month correspondence between her and her roommate Sandy and me. And if I can, while I'm on that subject, just jump ahead a little bit. Initially, their letters were all peace, love, and yes, the family, as the media calls us, were bound together by our belief in harmony and community and so on. And in retrospect, I can see it was a kind of love bombing, telling me all these, trying to make me believe that they were well-meaning hippies, basically. But as the correspondence progressed, it got increasingly disturbing. And the first sign to me, they wanted me to do things for them. And I knew that meant do things for Manson, with whom they were in very close touch. He was nearby in Folsom Prison. And they wanted me to do things for them. And one of their letters in June began, we're moving out of the realm of words. Words don't do much, actions do. And a little further down on that same page, it said, if you're really concerned about your world, give me your life. And I thought, for one thing, the realm of words is the only one I want to occupy with you.
Yeah.
And I'm not prepared to give you my life. So my antennas went up at that point, and I thought, this is turning into something I didn't quite anticipate, but should have. And yeah, I was a kid. I was 20, 21 years old when this was going on. And then came a letter, a 16-page handwritten letter from Sandy Good. They wanted me to call heads of different corporations that they believed were damaging the environment in Western New York, where at the time I was staying with my parents. My dad was still an FBI agent, and I was corresponding not only with Manson, but with Sandy and Squeaky using my parents' home address. So these letters were coming to my parents' house. And on June 30th, Sandy wrote me and she said, I want you to call these corporation executives, use your meanest voice, and tell them Manson says. And if they say Manson who, tell them Manson, remember Sharon Tate? And then they began to talk about people getting their arms chopped off. And she said a wave of assassins will sweep through these people's homes and splash blood from room to room. And at that point, I thought, okay, now I definitely need to find a way out of this. And I did. I wrote a letter to them and sent it to a friend of mine who lived in Wisconsin and asked her to mail it from there to get a Wisconsin postmark. And in my letter, I told them I had left my Western New York address and I was hitchhiking around the country for the summer. And that worked as a way of getting them off my path. But then 2.5 months later, the national headlines screamed that Squeaky had attempted to assassinate then President Gerald Ford in a park in downtown Sacramento. So it became very obvious that when I had read signs of increasing urgency and desperation on their part, I was reading the signs accurately.
Back in a moment. Hello all, this is Erik. So Batch is a Wisconsin-based hemp wellness brand founded by chemical engineers, people who actually understand formulations, not just marketing. They're built on full lab transparency, clean ingredients, and nothing you can't verify. I want to talk about something that doesn't get said enough. Sometimes you just stop feeling like yourself. It's not just one big thing, it's the sleep that's off, the mood that's harder to manage, that sense of running on empty. There are things that can help. Micromints are one. Sublingual CBD THC mints designed for daily calm and mood support. Not sedation, not a buzz, just feeling more like yourself. No grogginess, no dependency, no pharmaceutical side effects. And their CBD nighttime gummies are great for sleep quality, not just falling asleep, but staying asleep. For my female listeners, they can also help with that perimenopause-related sleep disruption without hormones or prescriptions. Better sleep means better mood, patience, and clarity the next day. This isn't about getting high or checking out. It's about getting back to baseline, being present without white-knuckling it. Me personally, I'm a little late to the gummy game, but I haven't been sleeping well in recent months, so I tried one of the CBD nighttime gummies for multiple nights, and I got full 8 hours of sleep, woke up feeling good, alert, and it was honestly shocking in the best way possible. Right now, Batch is offering 30% off site-wide, including subscriptions. Go to hellobatch.com/notorious and use code notorious at checkout.
Every Wednesday, we cover AI and robotics on intelligent machines. Hi, this is Leo Laporte, inviting you to join me, Paris Martineau, and Jeff Jarvis. This week, I interview Daniel Meisler. He's a security expert, been doing it for 24 years, but also an AI guru. We're going to talk about the security implications of Anthropic's new Mythos model. They say it's so powerful, they can't release it. How powerful is it? We'll find out. This week on Intelligent Machines, you'll find it at twit.tv/IM or wherever you get your podcasts.
And we have returned. Were you thinking that you would have some use for this down the road? Or was it just purely curiosity, self-interest?
It was based on my own interest. At the time, I had no thought that I would ever write about this or do anything. I was just absorbed in this personal investigation into these people who I found fascinating. And one just footnote on that, Erik, that's interesting, I think. After Squeaky Fromm's attempt to assassinate President Ford, the FBI in Sacramento sent, at the time, I think it would have been, I don't even think they had fax machines. It was in the mid 70s, probably a teletype or something, to the FBI office in Buffalo where my dad was working at the time. And they said, gee, we found this large cache of letters in Squeaky's apartment from someone named Jeff Smalldon, and he's using Agent Jack Smalldon's address. And so my boss called my dad in and said, gee, Jack, I don't know what this is about, but the FBI says they found a bunch of letters from someone named Jeff Smalldon, and he's citing your address as his return address. And so my dad needed to explain to his boss that, yeah, that's my wayward son, Jeff. He's not a danger to anyone. So I think they were mainly concerned about me, that other Manson family sympathizers might try to get in touch with me. and that I could be in danger.
Yeah. So at this point, what were you thinking direction-wise? Did you want to become a forensic psychologist at this point, or was your mind going in a different direction?
Definitely thinking a different direction. The thought of becoming a forensic psychologist had never entered into my mind. It was the furthest thing from my mind. I was going to get my PhD in English and become an English professor. That was the long-term plan. And after getting my undergraduate degree, I went to do my master's in English at Purdue. And then I returned to my alma mater, Valparaiso University, and taught in the English department there for a year. And then I get a grant to study modern Irish literature at Trinity College in Dublin. So I went to Ireland and spent a year there. And it was an absolutely fantastic year. But during that year, it gradually dawned on me that even though I loved studying literature, I didn't think academia would be a good fit for me. At the time, the prevailing ethos around graduate departments in English was publish or perish. And I didn't want to place myself in that kind of environment where I'd be expected to prove my intellectual mettle over and over again. I just thought, I don't think I'd be happy doing that. So I literally, and this is a major fulcrum point in my story, I returned from Ireland with no real plan. And my first thought was, well, yeah, I've always put Dad on a pedestal. Maybe I should become an FBI agent like him. And so he put me in touch with the guy who he worked with, who was in charge of screening applicants. And I went down to take this 3-part test. And one was a spelling test of all things. I think reflecting Hoover's obsessive interest in accuracy and spelling and so on. There was a spelling test. Then there was what was called a general information test. And then there was a personality inventory. And after I took these tests, I went in to meet with the agent who had, been in charge of setting up my testing. And he said, well, you aced the spelling test. You got the highest score I can remember of anyone on the general information test, but your personality test presents a problem. And I remember I said, well, what kind of problem? And he said, well, you come across as someone who doesn't easily yield to authority. And of course, my internal dialogue is something like, duh. But he didn't really know me. And he said, I'll tell you what, Jeff, I'm going to let you take that test again. And I'm sure he did that just because he was a friend of my dad's. And he said, when you take it again, I want you to take it with the mindset that you're in the military, where chain of command and hierarchies are very important. And being willing to obey commands of your superiors is very important. I want you to think like that when you take the test the next time. So I said, I'll give it my best. And I took it again, and he said, well, the results are basically the same. And so my personality type basically ended my FBI dreams. And then once that didn't pan out, I literally had no idea what I was going to do. And my mom, who was a nurse at the local hospital, said, have you ever thought of hospital administration? And I said, no, not only have I never thought of hospital administration, I don't have any idea what it is. And she said, well, there are a couple of good-looking young men down at the hospital where I work. I've heard them referred to as administrators. They're always friendly when they greet me in the hallway. Why don't you go down and talk to one of them? I didn't have anything else going on, so I did. And I liked this guy I talked with, and I think he responded positively to me. And at the end of our hour, he said, I'll tell you what, Jeff, go do your master's at George Washington University, which is where he had done his, and then come back and work for me. And it almost sounded like a job offer. I thought, wow, okay, well, so I did. I applied to George Washington. It was the only school I applied to. Had they not accepted me, I would have gone on to taken some other path forward. But they did accept me, weirdly enough, even though I'd never taken a business class in my life. And I got a generous financial package, so I went there. And for the second portion of that degree, we had to do a 1-year administrative residency at a hospital somewhere in the United States. And I had friends who went to San Francisco and Boston and Miami, all over the place. And I ended up in Columbus, Ohio, which is where I still live. I ended up in Columbus, Ohio, at what was then the largest private general hospital in Ohio. And I had never been to Ohio before, never been to Columbus, so it was totally new for me. And I think at the end of my residency, I was well liked, and they saw me as kind of an up-and-coming striver. So I stayed on, and I kept getting promoted. And by 1983, 2 years after I had landed there, I was an assistant vice president. I had responsibility for a 138-bed mental health and addiction services unit and a number of other smaller departments in the hospital. And one of those smaller departments was a research lab that had a total of 6 employees, and it was located just off the corridor from the hospital's main corridor. It had a single door that served as entrance and exit, and it was about the size of an average living room. It was a small lab. And before Christmas that year, 1983, as administration's representative, I attended their small department Christmas party, and everyone seemed upbeat, talking about their plans for the holidays. And then I went home to my parents in Western New York, and I get a call while I'm there. I don't remember the exact date of it. It must have been shortly after the New Year. I get a call from the public relations director, and she says, "Jeff, we've had a horrible tragedy." And I'm thinking something has gone wrong in the mental health unit, because we had had a couple of horrible tragedies there already. And that's what I was expecting. And instead she says, Joyce McFadden and Patty Maddox were murdered in the research lab on Friday afternoon. And I said, what? Like, literally nothing could have shocked me more than that. And she said, yeah, someone between 4:30 and 5:05 in the afternoon killed Joyce and Patty. Both women had had many stab wounds, like 20 or more. One of them was found in a freezer that was used to store tissue samples. The other one was laid out on the floor. And I said, I couldn't think to say anything except no way. And we ended that conversation, and I guess I waited a day and then drove back to Columbus. And in the days after, the police didn't arrest anyone. There were no identified primary suspects. All of us who worked at the hospital had our favorite suspects who we thought might have committed the murders. And the person who was my favorite suspect, I was interacting with every day. He was the director of that small research lab. He was the first one on the crime scene who identified the first body and then ran out in the hallway screaming for help. But he would come to my office and weep over Joyce's and Patty's deaths. And I'm sitting there thinking, I think there's a good chance that you did this. Even though, before the murders, it never would have crossed my mind that he would be capable of killing someone. But my point, I guess, is that it made going to work very stressful for me. And after a number of months, I decided this little foray into the business environment, hospital administration, was an interesting gambit for me, but that was never going to be the right niche. I was never meant to be a businessman. So I thought, I'm going to go back to graduate school, get my PhD, and hopefully be able to establish a forensic practice where I can get a close vantage point from which to study the minds and motives of killers. Because by that time, I thought the whole Manson chapter had been almost a decade before. And now this double homicide in one of the departments I had administrative responsibility for. And I felt like death is somehow following me, or I'm meant to do something because death has returned to my life again after the period of the Manson correspondences. So that's what I did. And, then I went on to open a forensic practice. And over a period of about 25 years, I worked on close to 300 death penalty cases in both state and federal court. So I kind of did what I set out to do, but it was a long, winding road to get to the point where I set out to do that.
So now, was that double homicide solved? And did it have anything to do with your original suspect?
I'm glad you asked me that, Eric. It's a fascinating story. I was wrong about my suspect, but the police didn't arrest anyone. Months went by, and finally, in spring of 1986, so 2.5 years after the murders had been committed, I pick up my paper one day from the front porch and big screaming headline, worst shootout in FBI history. I think 2 agents were killed, 4 or 5 others wounded, and 2 suspects were killed in this shootout with the authorities. And the article said that the suspects killed had been identified with a series of brazen guerrilla type daytime bank robberies. They were suspected of at least one murder. So they had gone on this crime spree. And I'm reading down the first column of the article, and it said the 2 suspects killed in the shootout were Michael J. Platt and William Maddox, formerly of Columbus, Ohio. And I came to that and I thought, William Maddox? Not Bill Maddox, not that very conservative Baptist church attending guy whose hand I shook at the memorial service for the 2 victims of the double homicide. Not that Bill Maddox. But then further on in the article, it said Maddox's wife was killed under mysterious circumstances 2.5 years ago in Columbus, Ohio. And as it turned out, and this is one particularly poignant detail of that story, at the time these double homicides took place, Bill Maddox and his wife Patty had a 4-month-old baby, their first child. And what everyone who's followed that case is sure happened is that Maddox decided, I'm bored with this suburban life. I'm bored with this relationship with my wife. I'm looking for more stimulation and excitement. I want to escape this world I'm in. And so he hooked up with an old army buddy of his, Michael Platt, and the two went to Florida. Bill Maddox took his infant daughter with him, and they started a lawn care business. Maddox joined a church singles group, remarried, had fathered at least 2 children in Florida before he was killed in the shootout. And this is about a decade ago now. I had lunch with one of the chief homicides in the hospital murder case. And after the shootout in Miami, he went down there and searched the apartments of the 2 men who had been shot, Maddox and Platt, looking for some concrete evidence that would definitively tie Maddox to the murders in Columbus. And he didn't find any. But he said there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that those 2 were involved in the murders. One or the other of them committed the murders, or they did it together. Interestingly enough, and this is the last thing I'll say about that, very recently, maybe 3 or 4 months ago, I was contacted by someone I had known during the days when I was at the hospital back in the early 80s. He was the head of the hospital's family practice center. And when the guy who discovered the crime scene, discovered the first body, ran out screaming into the hallway, he happened to be in the hallway. His name was Dr. Ed Bope. And so Dr. Bope went in and confirmed that the victim on the floor had no pulse. And they contacted the police, obviously. And soon after the police arrived, But Ed Bope, the doctor, who was a casual friend of mine back in the day, this is a long time ago. This is 1983, contacted me. He had read my book and read the chapter on the hospital murders and was very interested in it. And he said, would you be interested in me writing down my memories of my brief involvement that day? And I said, absolutely. So he did. And one of the interesting things he said, like back when those hospital murders took place, again, the idea of becoming a forensic psychologist had not yet even entered my mind. So I wasn't into crime scene analysis, even though I was the administrator responsible for the lab. Obviously, it was marked as a crime scene initially until the police conducted their investigation, and then the hospital hired an outside crew to clean everything up. But I didn't go into the lab after the murders while it was still designated a crime scene. But when Ed Bope wrote his memories, one of the interesting things he said was, I immediately noticed that Joyce, who was the woman on the floor of the main lab, he said, I immediately noticed that there were no defense wounds. And I also noticed that she had been stabbed many times around the chest and throat. And I thought right away, two people had to have committed this murder. Someone would have needed to restrain her from behind so that someone could land that many stab wounds to the front of her body. Had there not been someone holding her still while she was being stabbed, there would have been evidence of a struggle, and there wasn't. And I thought that was fascinating because it pointed to the involvement of both Maddox, Bill Maddox, Joyce's or Patty's husband, and the other guy, Jay Platt.
It sounds like you have an interest in crime scene investigation. Do you have like an intuitive ability to do that?
No, I wish I could say yes to that, Eric, but I can't. My job, unlike what a lot of people assume when they hear the phrase forensic psychologist, really had nothing to do with crime scene analysis and forensics. There are people who specialize in crime scene analysis, but they're associated with police departments and the FBI. Like the FBI has a couple psychologists on their staff in Quantico who do behavioral profiling or assist with it. But I never did any profiling and I never did any crime scene analysis. What I did was typically when a suspect was arrested on a death penalty case, the defense attorneys would retain me to conduct an evaluation of their client and advise them on any issues related to competency to stand trial or the possibility of a mental health defense, which almost never happened, and to prepare for sentencing. If the person was found guilty, then the defense gets an opportunity during what's typically referred to as the sentencing part of the trial or the mitigation phase. And the defense is able to put on family members and expert witnesses to provide the jury with information that might or might not influence their decision about whether to come back with a death verdict. And that's typically where I would come in, not as any kind of advocate for the defense or certainly for the defendant, but as an educator to tell the jury what I've found out as a result of my multiple interviews with the defendant, extensive battery of tests, typically interviews with family members and other collateral informants. So that was my typical role. Again, not profiling, not crime scene analysis. I wish I could say that I thought I had, good intuitive understanding of crime scenes that allowed me to draw inferences from them about what kind of person would have committed the crime, how the crime went down. But I really don't. I mean, I think if I credit myself with intuitive skills, it was more as an interviewer. I think I was a good interviewer in the sense that I was able to establish a rapport even with these very violent men, in part because they saw me as someone who could potentially assist them at the sentencing phase of their trial through my testimony. But also, not all forensic psychologists would agree with this approach, but it's the approach that worked best for me. I always tried to establish a horizontal plane so that I was speaking on the same plane as the defendant. I never wanted to come across as an expert and interrogating them, or I don't know, treating them less than because I had my PhD. I tried to establish a kind of conversational, very informal basis for the interview. If they told me that, well, one of the, I carried around a mental outline in my head for conducting these interviews, and one of the things I would always do is say, do you have any special interests or things you really enjoy doing? And if they responded with something that I had a basis for relating to, either because I had the same interest or I had a particular interest in what they said was their interest, I was very willing to kind of go off script and talk about that with them for a while. And sometimes that provided a good basis for rapport. So I don't know if it was instinct or skills developed during my graduate studies, but I think I was a good interviewer and had a pretty good intuitive grasp of how to draw people out.
Another quick break. Back in a jiff.
Every Sunday, we talk about the week's tech news on This Week in Tech. Hi, this is Leo Laporte inviting you to join me, Harper Reed, AI guru, Amy Webb, futurist. We talk about the week's tech news. All those CEOs going with the president to China. What did they accomplish? Jensen Huang hitching a ride in Alaska. And why backpacks suddenly got so terrible. Tune in Twit every Sunday. You'll find it at twit.tv or wherever you get your podcasts.
And we have returned again. So can I ask about your correspondence with Ted Bundy?
Absolutely. I started graduate school in fall of 1985, and the Riverside murders were less than, they had occurred in December 83, so they were less than 2 years in the rearview mirror, but still very much on my mind. The police hadn't arrested anyone. The shootout in Miami hadn't occurred yet. That would be 8 months down the road. So when I started graduate school, I got to thinking,